Episode 7. In this episode I wanted to go over the engine ancillaries and show how to break them down for servicing. I'll also be looking at the condition of some of the engine parts. It's a reference that I've never had when judging what good looks like, so hopefully it will help others with their engine builds as well. All the way through this, keep in mind that the engine has done 105,000 miles for reference. I'm running out of parts on the conveyor belt now, so let's jump straight into the work. First of all, let's start by looking at the camshafts. The end caps have to come off first. The fixings are already gone, along with the turbo heat shield that was removed a while back off camera. I used an aluminium punch here to gently tap the end caps off from one side and then the other. They are held in by an O-ring seal and in my case some silicone snot. Next up I use my my impact driver to get the thrust washer bolts off. As you can see, it took a fair amount of work to get this off, but the tool does negate the requirement to hold the cam pulley wheels in a vise or something. As you can see, the exhaust camshaft still has a lot of oil inside of it. I think that's just because of where it sits on the slanted cylinder head. It doesn't drain so well, so just something to be aware of. Now the thrust washers are retrieved. They are set for the correct end float for each camshaft, so don't mix them up. Now let's take the tooth pulley wheel off. Not my favourite method, I just don't like using bearing pullers. I find that setting the legs up is like herding cats. However, it worked and it came off with very little resistance. The front oil seal can now be had and the shaft withdrawn out of the housing. As you can see, I used a seal puller to remove the camshaft seal. It worked fine and didn't damage the casting because I was pressing on the seal itself. However, looking back, when I do this job again, I would probably just tap the rear of the camshaft towards the front to ease the seal out. Now it's all dismantled, here's a few images of the condition the components were in. I can't see anything here of any significance. It all looks in pretty perfect condition. Sorry for the bad camera quality here. I should upgrade the camera, but it's not like I've got a car to build. The exhaust side is a lot dirtier. Again, I think this is because it doesn't drain very well. Something to look at later, but it does show the importance of regular oil changes. Now let's look at the camshafts themselves. What's immediately apparent is the blackening and scoring on the lobes. I must admit the followers are in pretty perfect condition, so there's no reciprocal markings. A quick look under the microscope and you can see that these scratches are in fact not scratches at all. They seem to just be surface contamination, so a quick polish up should remove this effect. Some of the bearing faces have staining on them as well. Again, I think this is where the engine has sat for such a long time, and again these will be polished out. So all in all, the camshafts seem pretty fine. Now to strip the oil pump. Keeping in mind that my car does not have the charge cooler pump housing fitted to this assembly, as I'm going to replace it for an electric pump modification later. First, the pump housing needs to come off. Take off the surrounding bolts and then you can remove the housing. Mine was super stubborn, so it needed a few persuasions. I got a bit fed up with it in the end, and then it came off like this, with the pump annulus flying out. Not ideal, but as I keep saying, it's all going to be renewed anyways. This pump looks okay, but you'd never take the risk on something this important. Here is the condition of the inside of the housing. No signs of wear on the machine face, so that's another good sign. Now the circlip has to be removed in order to withdraw the rotor. This was fiddly. But if you can get in under here, then you can get it out quite easily. Or as someone said to me on the previous video, just invest in the proper tools. I don't have gorilla arms, by the way. The camera just makes me look like a Sasquatch when I am in fact not. Remove the rotor by knocking the shaft backwards. Sorry for the bad footage here, but you kind of get the idea. Again, I use my aluminium punch here to tap the shaft backwards. Here's the rotor. It looks okay, but it will be going in the bin regardless. With all that done, the shaft assembly simply slides out. The pulley wheel has a centre bolt holding it on, although it need not have, as this thing was on so tight I was really concerned about how to get it off without damaging it. The bearing puller wouldn't touch it, so I switched tactics and set it up in the lathe. At this point my camera decided to stop filming, so I'll just recreate what I did. The piece was set in a chuck loosely so that it could float around, but enough to support the central hub of the toothed wheel. By impacting the shaft I was able to drift it out. However, directly behind the wheel is another small circlip that I didn't see. This got caught on the key, so it took a bit of a beating. As always, it's not really a drama as it's going to be renewed. You could just as easily do this job in a press, I just chose to do it this way. Here you can see the corrosion on the shaft and appreciate why it didn't really want to come off. When steel rusts like this, it tends to swell and then seize itself onto something like aluminium. However, when this goes back together, it'll all be polished up like new. Finally, this oil seal has to be clawed out. Careful not to knock the tripod over. Here is a view of the inside of the casting. Again, it looks fine, nothing really to report here. Lastly, for the ancillaries, it's the water pump. We know from episode 6 this is in a pretty bad way, so it has to be reconditioned. In the parts manual this is labelled as a non-serviceable item, but that's not going to stop me from trying. First is to measure the offset from the pulley mount to the face of the casting. This is important so when the shaft is pressed back in, the pump's drive belt will be correctly in line. Next up is to cut this part off from the shaft. I used a 1mm thick slitting saw on the angle grinder here, but unfortunately I have no footage of this, which is a shame because I actually cut into my shoe at the same time. After counting my toes, the off cut of the shaft was pressed out of the hub and then thrown away. The next job is to put the oven on. If you're married or whatever, now is the time to make sure the missus isn't watching. Heating the aluminium casting up will make it expand more than the steel shaft inside, making it easier to push out. By not doing this, you run the risk of cracking the pump housing when pushing out the impeller. I don't even know if you can still get these anymore, so sending the missus out and sneaking it into the oven is your best bet. Once the pump has been cooked, the shaft and bearing assembly can be pressed out. As you can see, the heating meant the shaft didn't put up much of a fight and the impeller plops out nice and easy. Here it is in all its glory. Yep, I definitely think I'll be replacing this. The pump body was vapor blasted to better understand its condition. As you can see, it's quite heavily pitted. A close-up of the bearing sealing face also shows pitting. This might be an issue or it may not, but that's one for later. With the major parts now stripped down, let's have a look at the condition of the other parts of the engine, starting with the pistons and liners. The liners in the Esprit are forged aluminium with Nikasil coating. They look like they're in great condition to me, with the distinct honing marks still visible, and the Nikasil isn't falling off or anything silly like that. If this is a standard engine, they could probably be recoated and reused, but pretty much everyone I've talked to has said to go with brand new cast iron liners. Another fun fact is that these forged alloy liners are no longer available, so it kinda does suggest going towards cast iron. The pistons are where things start to tell a tale. Initially I saw a few marks on the crown of piston number 1, but I put it off to someone being lazy when doing the timing and scoring it with a screwdriver or something. This happens when trying to find the engine top dead centre, which you commonly do on piston number 1. With the pistons now cleaned, along with other evidence, I firmly believe the engine has had a cam belt failure. Piston 1 shows this the most, with the crown being damaged quite heavily, as well as witness marks from valve strikes. You can see them also on pistons 2, 3, and finally piston 4. This is the floating gudgeon pin or wrist pin that holds the piston onto the connecting rod. The brown area is normal, as they are slightly undersized here. Here is a shot of the big end or crank shaft bearing. Note the brown area is where the shell bearings have worn through into the copper and would indicate that they need replacing. The connecting rods are rock solid, so nothing really much to report here. Finally, this image shows the underside of the piston with the oil relief holes. Irrespective of all the wear and damage, all of these parts are going to be replaced with new forged pistons and lightweight connecting rods when the engine goes back together. Working down the engine, we come to the forged crankshaft. There are two features worth noting here. Firstly is the cross-drilled straight shot holes that connect the main journals to the connecting rod journals. These permit oil to be fed directly to the bearings under pressure. The second noteworthy element is the design, which is referred to as a partially counterweighted crankshaft, which means that the counterweights are not each side of the main journals. This makes the crankshaft lighter but limits the top end RPM as it has less than ideal balance. Also note that the counterweights are pretty chunky. This means that they can drag on the oil spray inside of the engine, causing power losses to windage. To what extent I don't know, but it might be interesting to find out. Anyways, it's still in great condition and I was very relieved to see that there was no scoring on the journals, which show that it has had good oil pressure. The plan is to get the journals properly measured to ensure the correct size and out of round before deciding on whether to regrind them or not. Here are the main bearing shells. You can see the wear on the faces from the offset thrust angle where the grey aluminium has warmed down to the copper. The drilled halves are there so it can let the oil in to lubricate. Because these are at the top of the crank, there is very little wear on the surfaces, apart from the one on the right which is closest to the cam belt. This is due to the cam belt itself pulling this end of the crank upwards under tension. The semicircular parts on the left are the thrust shims. These are situated next to the flywheel and towards the rear of the engine. Let's now look at the major castings before this video gets too long. Before handling, I cleaned the block up with WD-40 and brake cleaner. before hitting the shower to get all the oil off. I'm sound as a pound, but you definitely don't want to be caught in the shower by your other half, giving it some serious rubber ducky with your engine block. I suspect it will earn you a couple of nights on the couch, so keep that in mind. There isn't much to report here on the block other than the horrible deposits I found inside the liner housing. It's hard to tell just how much of this came from standing for so long, or whether there's an issue with the coolant flow stagnation or just plain contamination. The recesses around the outside of the liner seats have terrible coolant flow around them, which means that the deposits would gather here. Maybe that's by design. Whilst removing the block core plugs, I noticed that one of them was incredibly stuck. Once I finally got it released, you can see it's been backed up entirely with antifreeze crystals or whatever this stuff is. Again, there's no coolant flow around this area, so without regular coolant changes, corrosion has occurred and it's actually damaged the thread. I may have this repaired or retapped so that the plug can get deeper into the block and stop this from happening again. We'll see. All in all, this is a 32-year-old engine and I was really happy to see that this was the only corrosion to the block. Nice. Now let's get onto the cylinder head and head gasket. It was a bit tricky to look at the cylinder head with all the grime over it, but the main issue here is the mating face to the gasket, so I decided to have a look at this first. Nothing of major concern was found other than this little issue that did not escape my attention. On the engine block there are two dowel pins and therefore two corresponding holes in the cylinder head to ensure that the correct orientation is achieved. But some wally has put this head back on the wrong way round, and the pins have marked the undrilled side of the head. No real damage, but it proves again that the head has been removed during the car's lifetime. Next, the cylinder head was vapour blasted to get all the muck off so it could be inspected further. With all the carbon etc. removed, I can see that the gasket face hasn't been skimmed from what I can see, as there is still quite a lot of material above the valve seat line. I will need to get it properly measured, but it looks pretty good to me. I also wanted to check the valve seats for cracks. There were none, but some had started to pit and corrode. This is not a major deal as the head is going to have a complete overhaul anyway. The only issue with all this vapour blasting is the residue blast medium that is left behind. This gets absolutely everywhere, and so the cylinder head and any other internal part that has had this process done to it needs to be totally cleaned out afterwards. As can be seen from the image, the medium is tiny. The larger grit is actually table salt for scale. This means it can merge easily with grease and oil to form a grinding paste. This is not good news for the internals of your engine. Lastly, let's have a quick look at the condition of the head gasket. I'm no expert with these engines, but it looks fairly good to me. As noted, the cylinder head has been removed, so I have no idea on how old this gasket is. This side is the cylinder head, and this side is for the engine block and liners. So that's it for this episode. It's dragged on a bit, but I hope you found it useful. I know there has been a large gap between the last two episodes. There is a lot to unpack from that time period, but I just haven't found a good way to present it yet. All I can say is that as of early August 2022, the project is being worked on almost every single day. It's still my main priority and things are coming together, albeit a bit slowly for my liking. I am working on a more up-to-date progress video, but producing it has been hard as there is a lot to discuss. Until then, cheers and thanks for watching.